The superficial similarities between the stories of Marcy Wu in Amphibia and Luz Noceda in The Owl House have resulted in the two characters being vaguely grouped together. This is understandable. They are both nerds. They both yearn to escape to a fantasy world, and when they finally do, it's a dream come true. They're both lonely and isolated in the human world, and they find a larger family and community to support them in the fantastical world. But although drawing similarities between these two characters is understandable, extending these similarities too far is short-sighted. Examining these two characters through the frameworks of their decisions to leave home reveals significant differences between their motives and their impulses and their general situations. They are both reluctant to return home. That they have in common. But Luz has no fear or dread about returning home. She doesn't want to leave behind the supportive family she has in the Owl House, who understands her eccentricities and creativities and is willing to support them while still holding her accountable. But Luz does not hate returning home. She was kind of lonely and isolated on Earth, but she was not miserable. Marcy was. Marcy has a genuine level of fear and anxiety about returning home that stretches far beyond mere reluctance to leave behind the prosperous and intellectually fertile life she has there in Amphibia. I support both their desires to stay in the fantastical realms they found themselves in, for the record. I'm not one of those Puritans who is very adamant that these characters must live with their ordinary realities, as deprived of joy and relief and comfort as that reality may be. I'm not one of those people. But I am someone who knows that Marcy's situation is significantly more dire than Luz's, and because of that I think grouping the two of them together is short-sighted. Luz is a more grounded person because she went to the Boiling Isles, paradoxically. She finds the growth and maturity that she needed in this fantastical world, and that's great. But she would have been fine had she stayed in her own realm. She would have had a less exciting life, but her life would still not have been a disaster. She had a loving mother who did not completely understand her, but still wanted the best for her and tried to support her any way she could. Marcy did not have that. When Marcy clings to the bond she has, both with her old friends Anne and Sasha, and with her bonds in her new life in Amphibia, she doesn't just do this because it's fun and because it's enjoyable, or even because it helps her grow and mature, although it is fun and it does help her grow and mature. She does this because the alternative of returning home is so ghastly from Marcy's perspective that it is something she needs to defend herself against at all costs. Here in Amphibia, she finally has a place that nourishes her excitability and her intellect and her ambition. But that disintegrates before her. It's revealed to be a lie. The patchwork community she's formed is nothing but a facade. And because that community has been a wellspring of reliability and compassion for Marcy, Marcy is driven to despair when she's left with none of that. Luz's life before the Boiling Isles is far from ideal. She's lonely, she's isolated, She feels that no one at her school understands her because she's weird and awkward. And also, though she doesn't say this, because she's very open and excitable. But Camilla is right to an extent. One can argue whether Camilla should have sent her off to that soul-draining camp, but Luz really did need to become more grounded. It's not healthy to go through life just floating ethereally above one's circumstances and environment. It's not that Luz is pushed to such extremes that she detaches from her ordinary lived-in experience. Unlike Marcy, whom we'll come back to later, Luz just would rather live in her own imagination. And her mother rightly realizes that while there's nothing wrong with the imagination, and that it can be a very powerful force, one should still not neglect one's own life and one's own relationships with other people. And it's not like the people who inhabit the human world in the Owl House are uniformly cruel. V makes a lot of friends, even though V has absolutely no experience with the human world. And even though V is a literal alien who needs to keep the loose disguise on just to be accepted in this society. Even considering this, V is far more successful at making friends than Luz, which suggests to some extent that Luz is a flawed person and her own individual perspective and viewpoints are preventing her from really acclimating to her life there in Connecticut as well as she probably could be. Now, this doesn't mean Luz's friendlessness and her isolation are 100% her fault, but it does thankfully mean it's something she has some measure of control over. If she grows more mature and more considerate of other people, as she does in Amphibia, as she does in the Boiling Isles, making friends even on Earth would not be nearly as much of a problem, I think. Bizarrely, Luz's fantasy world in the Boiling Isles acts in the exact opposite way of how she thinks it will be. And this does not lead her to resignation, it does not break her spirit. Rather, it causes her to see through the cracks in her old worldview and become a more empathetic and thoughtful person. She's far more engaged in her lived-in reality than she was back in Connecticut. She learns that her romanticized ideal of what a fantasy world would be like is simply incorrect. There are some aspects of her life that are better than they were on Earth. She gains acceptance to the magic school Hexide, but she's still an outcast there. She still has to gain people's trust and acceptance. And this is most concretely exemplified in the character of Amity Blight, the bully and star student who slowly transitions into becoming Luz's friend and then Luz's love interest, or girlfriend, in large part because of the compassion and tender love and openness that Luz demonstrates toward Amity. Luz, faced with a situation in which she is isolated, just like she was on Earth, responds much differently. Instead of retreating into fantasy, she acts. She tries her best in her own very earnest way to try and reach out to people. And Luz also has Ida, who is a significantly different parental figure than Camilla was. If Camilla has any real faults, it's being a little overprotective of Luz, which is understandable, but that's not really what Luz needs. Luz needs someone who's kind of wild and eccentric like her, but also someone who's not afraid to ask a lot of Luz and try and hold Luz to account when Luz doesn't always measure up to her potential, and that is what Ida does. She models for Luz the way that a weird, eccentric person can exist in the world and still live outside one's own ego and one's own perspectives and look at the world from a larger point of view, instead of always thinking about what's best for merely the individual. Now, Ida is of course not the most selfless person in the world, but she does have a much wider and more nuanced picture of the world, even being an outsider, than Luz does. And Luz learns from Ida. She matures in that regard. Now, to a certain extent, Luz could have achieved this level of empathy, this level of being able to look outside one's own individual perspective, even had she stayed in Connecticut. Now, it would have been harder, but Luz does not really need a fantasy world, even though that's what she thinks she needs. What she really needs is a place that encourages her and says that it's okay that she has all these eccentricities, while also trying to inspire her to be a better person and to take control of her own life and realize that she is, in a lot of respects, responsible for the choices she makes and the consequences of those choices. Marcy, however, really needed to leave California. Luz's situation was that of an awkward middle school kid just trying to fit in and not being able to. Marcy's situation was significantly more severe. I'm not saying her parents were necessarily abusive, but she loathed being there. She found her home environment repressive to her ambition, her intellect, and her sense of independence, all of which are extremely important to Marcy. Unlike Luz, who doesn't really have a lot of strong convictions other than a basic moral sense of trying to do what's right, Marcy does have really strong ideals. She has strong ideas of what she thinks will work and what she thinks would be better for herself and those around her. But because she's a kid, and because she's in an environment she considers rather repressive, she can't express those ideas. In a Nietzschean sense, she's very much turned against her own values and her own ideals by the norms and mores of a society that does not consider her to conform to the precepts of what is right and proper. Unlike Luz, she does not withdraw from her relationships in the human world. She has close friends in Anne and Marcy, and she does not withdraw from school. She commits herself wholeheartedly to that, getting straight A's constantly. But other than in school, she's miserable. Her celerity of mind and her ambitious curiosity are not given proper outlets to flourish. School is really the only place where they can be sublimated. And Marcy gradually becomes resentful. She feels such a disconnect from her environment, from the people who claim to care about her. All she has to rely upon is these friendships with Anne and Sasha. And when her parents threaten to tear her away from these friendships, she becomes despondent to the point that she is willing to take the three of them into another world just to preserve their friendships. One can say that Marcy was right or wrong to be willing to do this, but I think that's kind of missing the point. The question one should be asking ourselves is how desperate Marcy had to be in order to make that choice, in order to be willing to leave with her friends like that. And her desperation extends to such an extent that Marcy has no desire to return home even after spending about 6 months there in Amphibia. She has no desire to see her parents again. She has no desire to resume her old life. It was a nightmare that she feels that she's awakened from into this glistening, beautiful world of Amphibia. A world that's beautiful not because it replicates the worlds of her games, but because it allows the qualities Marcy has always had, her intellect, her ambition, her desire to help people on a large-scale, systematic way, to really flourish. Marcy is not flawless, but her experience is not the same as Luz. And applying the word escapism, a word I hate for a lot of reasons, to both contexts completely flattens the differences between them. Luz does need to adjust to some extent to the standards of her world to become a little more grounded and a little more realistic. Marcy succeeds by those standards, and yet she's completely miserable because she's a lonely person, as though she's floating on the ocean and she only has her friends as life rafts to cling to, and now those life rafts are going to be taken away. There's nothing sentimental or childish about Marcy's experience in Amphibia or the choices she makes. She's a desperate person. She acts desperately in a desperate situation. I probably would have done quite the same had I been her age and in her position. That makes her final betrayal by Andreas all the more gutting. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching Amphibia and the Owl House. Can't wait for Amphibia to come back. I hope you don't think I was too hard on Luz, but I will admit that I think V made some valid points at the end of Season 2A about Luz's decision to run away from a basically good life, just because it wasn't as perfect as Luz wanted it to be. So anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.